Hey. I feel like I should say, hey, y'all, because I'm in Texas, so I'll say, hey, y'all. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to be here with each of you. You have no idea, but I've been literally thinking about each of you for months, just wondering who was going to be here and what I could say that could possibly be of any value to anybody in the room. And so it's built this sense of anticipation, and so it's just great to be here. It feels like almost like I compare it to being pregnant. I feel like I've been pregnant with this entire room, like all of you, and I'm just so happy to be delivering the baby today. So here you go, here we go. So my hope really is today that we're able to learn some stuff together, maybe unlearn a few things, question some assumptions. We're gonna have some scandal, get ready for it. There's gonna be some scandal. We'll have a little bit of intrigue and a little bit of laughter, hopefully. And I really hope that we walk away, it's kind of big, but I hope we walk away reconsidering how we really walk through this life. Now, you might say that's a lot to promise from a South by Southwest EDU speech, and you'd be right, but I was a former teacher and a principal, and we're all educators in the room, and that's what we do, we deliver bigly. So we are going to do it today. So today I just want to explore this idea of justice through disruption. Justice. This is a really big word, and I feel that it doesn't just apply to the things we think about, right, like law and the courts, but it's really how we treat one another, both the people that we know, and I would argue even more importantly, the people that we don't know. And right now, I would also argue that we're not treating all people justly, especially those kids who I would argue are most vulnerable. And I believe that this injustice ultimately needs to be disrupted. And the time is really ripe for this. I just think about, we're living in the age of Amazon and Airbnb and Uber, and these companies have all managed to somehow reinvent their respective industries. And thanks to them, we've disrupted everything from the way we shop to how we travel to how we commute. But interestingly enough, and I think you guys get it, otherwise you wouldn't be here, we haven't quite figured out, or maybe we haven't just yet chosen to disrupt the way we treat the kids who are most at risk. And this to me, and I'm sure it is to you, is unacceptable, since every day that we really stand in the status quo is another day that another child's potential is ultimately diminished. And really, in certain circumstances, lives are lost. So today, I'm not going to talk about the whys. This will not be a whole history lesson about why it is we're here and why it is that real change hasn't happened. Many of you are seeing the whys as I saw as a principal and as a teacher, and even now that I see with Chicago Beyond. Many of you all are seeing the whys, right? It's things around apathy and entrenched interest and those things about inadequate resources and lack of investment in communities. I mean, the list is long. We could probably spend this entire hour just listing all the things of the why of why we're here. But instead, I really want to spend our time today just focused on what we can do, how we can do it, and how we can achieve disruption that can cause lives to change and to change them quickly. So I fundamentally believe that's what disruption does. Once it takes hold, things happen really, really fast. I mean, just think about it. If I had told you a couple years ago that you would think nothing of riding in a stranger's car or sleeping in a stranger's home, and you'd be really happy about it and you'd pay the privilege to do it, you'd have said I was crazy. But that's exactly what's happened. Let's just do a quick, just general survey by show of hands. How many of you in the last year have just spent a night through Airbnb? Anybody? Okay, look around, most of the room. How many of you in the last 6 months have taken an Uber, a Lyft, or some other ride-sharing service? Literally everybody in the room. And that's what it is, right? That's what disruption looks like. It's just like that. But here's the thing that I believe, and we're gonna spend some time today talking about, is before we can get disruption, whether it's in business or in other fields, we must first change our assumptions. And that's what happened to disruptors like Amazon, Uber, and Airbnb. Before they came along, people really believed that shopping needed stores, that taxi service needed taxis, and ultimately that when you traveled, you really needed a hotel. These companies showed us how to rethink these assumptions and reimagine our possibilities, and essentially, we're all benefiting from this new reality. In much the same way, I believe we need to change our assumptions about the kids who are most vulnerable, most forgotten. And I'm talking about kids like Jason. So Jason was one of my all-time favorite students at Finger High School where I served as principal, and that's him up on the screen. There's some people, I don't know if you guys have met them, they could be in your classroom, maybe just like adults that you know, but there's certain people that you meet that as soon as you meet them, you just feel like this automatic like affinity to them. There's like this energy, like you just, it's like they're your people, you know them. And Jason was one of those people to me. He was this tall, lanky kid. He kind of quiet voice, kind eyes. He never held any grudges, loved basketball. He loved Wendy's. And when he'd get really, really excited, he would do this thing where he like rubbed his hands together like this. And it didn't take much for him to do this whole thing with rubbing his hands together. I mean, we could be like, we're going to Wendy's. And he'd be like, all right, Miss Dozier, we're going to Wendy's. And he's like super excited. He was no angel, though. I want to be honest. He wasn't an angel. I remember this one day, the school secretary walked in the main office. She walked into my office, and she says to me, someone's here to see you. And she kind of had that like look on her face, like of irritation and like, ugh, you know? And so I'm like, okay, well, who's here to see me? And she was like, just come on outside. It's your boy. So I knew it was about to be somebody. She said, it's your boy. So I go out into the main office, and I see Jason sitting there. Now, he's not just sitting there. He's sitting there like this with a piece of paper in front of his face, and he's sitting just like this. And I said, hey, Jason, how's it going? He's like, it's going good, Miss Dozier. I'm like, is there a reason why you've got the paper in front of your face? Like, what's going on? He's like, oh, nothing. I'm here to say hi. I was like, great, you want to go ahead and take that piece of paper down? He was like, okay. And he was kind of like shy and bashful. So he takes the paper down, kind of coaxes him to do it. And then when he removes the paper, I see that he's gotten like these tattoos that are covering the eye, like around his eyes and his face. And he kind of had his head down, he looked embarrassed, and I was like, oh God, Jason, really? I mean, like, seriously, you're really gonna get your face tattooed? Like, that literally makes like no sense whatsoever. Like zero. But just like any kid, right, who had done something bad or something he was embarrassed about and knew had been found out, he had that same type of reaction. I mean, that's who Jason really was. He was this big, lovable kid. And he was complex, but I would argue that we all are. I would dare you to show me the person in this room who isn't somehow complex in who they are as a human being. Jason came from a challenging environment, and he didn't always do well in academics, so he wasn't my star honor roll student by any stretch of the imagination. He made some not so great decisions, like tattooing his face, but he was incredibly sweet and incredibly endearing as a kid. Now, if you saw him walking down the street, just walking down the street, you might make some different assumptions. At Finger, I got to know a lot of kids like Jason, and they might have appeared tough or tattooed, or people would say they were angry or they were perceived as aloof, but they were actually terribly fragile kids. And they were fragile because their ecosystem was fragile. And it really reminds me of like the coral reefs. I liken it to that, where all over the world, due to global warming, which does exist, these vibrant, beautiful organisms are being bleached to a dull gray because their ecosystems are no longer providing them the nutrients that they need. And this is what I saw happening to too many of my students. I mean, you saw some of it on the video that they showed right before I came up, and it gave you a quick glimpse into their ecosystem. And it wasn't giving, you can kind of imagine, just wasn't giving that physical, emotional, it wasn't giving them those spiritual nutrients they needed to thrive. And they were withering. They were dying, and they were dying for real dying. And as a result, some of my kids developed some really terrible coping mechanisms, some real harsh coping mechanisms to deal with the really harsh ecosystem in which they were living. Like those bleached coral, our kids were steadily being drained of their life. Now, I imagine a really good group of people like you guys don't come to South by Southwest because you're not optimistic, right? You're forward-thinking, you're purpose-driven, and ultimately you're sitting here because you want to impact all kids. You believe in creating and making the world different than it is, and about thinking about people in a different way. In short, I believe everyone in this room, otherwise you wouldn't be here, you believe in questioning your assumptions. And that's good, because as I said, if you don't question your assumptions, you don't get disruption. And disruption, I would argue, is what we urgently need in order to rescue kids on the margin, so they don't become adults on the margin. And unfortunately, changing assumptions is really not easy. We all have our bias or biases, which leads to us to jump to conclusions on we think what we know. So we're gonna play a little game. Are you ready? Now you all know I used to be a teacher and a principal. We're gonna try this again. Are you ready? Yes. Are you ready? Yes. All right, here we go. Throw up the slide. Can anyone guess? Okay, let's just do this. Shout out a few words that you think would describe this woman. Just shout them out. Now, you all know you're educated. You're going to do better than that. Go ahead, shout them out. Don't be shy. Dominican nun. Oh my gosh, we're getting real specific up in here. All right, give me some other adjectives that would describe that woman. Funny? Happy? Traditional. Give me one more. Religious, got it. Okay, well, that woman was all of those things. You got it right on the nose. But she was also my mom. What? Scandal, here we go. So I told you were gonna have some scandal. So you will notice, not one of you shouted out, she's your mother. You didn't say that. None of you made that assumption, but it's one of the keys to understanding why her picture is up there. It's about assumptions. But wait, it gets better. I'm gonna give y'all some real scandal. So get this. Do you wanna know how my parents met? We gotta do a little better. Do you wanna know how my parents met? Yes. Okay. Well, like the good nun my mom was, she was ministering to men in prison. And that's where she met my dad. And well, you might say things went a little bit off script. And then there was me. Yay, that's me. Tell me I was not cute. You know I was cute. We'll give you one more. That's me too. So cute. Now notice, none of you really thought anything like this when you first saw my mom's picture or the nun's picture. You made your assumptions. And you saw the image of a nun, and immediately your bias was triggered about what a nun does, and of course, what a nun doesn't do. And this is how we straight-jacket our brains. We literally straight-jacket our brains, and the truth often gets lost. Okay, so you didn't come to hear all about my family, and although I promise you if you did, like we would have this really, really interesting talk, but you could meet me at the cocktail hour, and I promise you I'll tell you like all about it. But right now, I want to talk to you about my school family, and especially my kids who were most vulnerable. Those who occupy what I would argue were like the smallest spaces. The kids who often went like unseen, unheard, ununderstood, if you will. And you have them in your schools or in your districts, or you're interacting with and serving those kids too. Because every school has them. Now, you got some idea what Finger was like in the opening video, and it shows some really harsh stuff. But I want to be clear, because I don't believe in like, casting out certain images that aren't accurate. So our school was not just filled with drama and darkness, let's be clear. I mean, there was definitely a subset and an undercurrent of that, and we dealt with some real deal stuff, but it wasn't just that. Our school also had a lot of joy in it. Now, don't get me wrong, we had fun. So like every school, we had kids goofing off of graduation, and that was me, because I was goofing off of graduation too. We had sports teams and cheerleaders and cliques and clubs. I mean, we even had, it was so embarrassing, but it's the truth. We even had teachers arguing over like who was gonna sell hot dogs outside the basketball game. I mean, like get kind of corny stuff. We had homecoming, dances, proms, I mean, you name it. Amidst all of that, things that should happen in a school, we also had a lot of things that shouldn't happen in a school. We had kids dying, and we had funerals. I mean, we truly had it all. But really, I would argue every school has it all. It's just in what proportion. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, because schools, ultimately, you see this every day, they're just microcosms of life. Now, I came to Finger in large part because of my parents. My mom was a super interesting woman, and she brought like this really strict kind of convent training to her home. So I was raised in this very rigid structure. And if I ever erred, there was this immediate correction, or like a really sharp word. And as for my dad, he's the one who really inspired me to pursue the work that I do. And I saw this in how basically what happened to his life, right? And that the system too often fails our citizens. My dad spent his earliest years in and out of foster care, and it kind of spiraled from there. And really, he never was able to become the architect of his own life. Even to this day, like, I still take care of my dad. And I see his lost potential. He's one of the smartest people that I know. Let me just say this. My dad is one of the smartest people you will ever want to meet. And to this day, he can't read. And I believe that I see his lost potential, and I never want that for another human being. Now, also because of who my parents were, I had a certain affinity for my kids at school. As a child of a biracial couple, I felt oftentimes like the other and didn't always fit in. I was a brown kid living in an all-white community. And sometimes the kids at Finger were often cast as society's other. They didn't quite fit in with the larger community. And they were oftentimes viewed with a mixture of fear or disdain by those who lived in healthier ecosystems. And at all levels, I got a chance to see, and I still see, how our bias really against our kids lead to these false assumptions about our kids. Now, just consider what this Chicago city official reportedly had to say about the kids, like the kids at Finger. He reportedly expressed this view that 25% of the city's young people of Chicago will never amount to anything, so we shouldn't, quote, throw money at them. Well, you know what? He's making some false assumptions. And then there was my encounter at this really large institute last year, and I had just spoken on this panel, and I had expressed my belief about, like, it doesn't matter to me what type of school kids go into. I just want all my kids, and just kids in general, to have a high-quality education. So this gentleman came up, and I said to him, like, I said in the talk, like, I never met a kid, maybe you all have. I never met a kid who said, I want to fail. I want to be a loser. I want to ... Never met a kid like that. So I was approached by this older gentleman afterward. He's a leader in the charter school movement, responsible for thousands of kids. And we had a bit of a back and forth about that. And you see, he told me I was wrong. And he said, and this is a quote, "Not every child wants to learn, Liz." And he said that it was his mission to teach those kids who, quote, wanted to learn. Interesting. And to that I said to him, well, what, my dear sir, happens to the others? And he was another person who was making false assumptions. When I hear these sorts of things, I think about Jason, who you guys had a chance to kind of meet and see on screen. As I said, like, he was one of my favorites, but I'm afraid he was one of those kids that city official would have put into that 25%. You know, the ones you just, don't throw money at them. Now, Jason was a pretty frequent visitor to my office because of one dust-up or another, and you can kind of allude to some of the dust-ups that he was in based on the fact that he was, getting his face tattooed and was involved in some things. But he had, if you can even imagine, he had this incredibly appealing innocence to him. And unlike the most kids, when they land in the principal's office, I mean, you all know, kids come to teachers and principals, and there's always an excuse. Oh, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Doggone well that was you. But that wasn't Jason. He didn't do that. He would come in, and he wouldn't say he didn't do it. He would just smile. He'd be like, all right, Miss Dozier, I know. I'm going to do better, Miss Dozier. I'm going to do better. So I felt this amazing affinity to him over the years and his time at Finger, and clearly, like, he did to me too. And so we stayed in touch even after I left Finger and he left Finger. And he continued to be open and honest with me, so I knew that Jason was no angel. But it was still a shock when my phone rang on March 20th of last year. It's almost been a year now, a year and 2 weeks actually, 2 weeks from today. And I was told that Jason had been shot. So I dropped what I was doing, and I rushed to the hospital, only to find out that he had died. Suddenly, Jason, this kid I literally adored, had become a statistic, one of 650 murders in Chicago in 2017. Jason taught me so much. He taught me how to see, he taught me how to unlearn, and he taught me that we're all better than the worst thing we've ever done. And none of us is as good as we can be. He taught me about deep humanity and vulnerability and the unbounded potential that lies within every young person and each of us, including those who it's so easy to write off. Too many of us otherize them by calling them thugs or gangbangers, or pick your adjective, whatever it is you want to call them. But Jason taught me to stop otherizing. He taught me that they're all just kids. I don't know if you guys know this gentleman. His name is Father Greg Boyle. If you're from LA, you might have heard of him. Yes, give up for Greg Boyle, please. If you don't know him, write his name down, look him up. Greg Boyle is the founder of Homeboy Industries out in LA, and it's an organization that employs former gang members. Father Boyle talks about kids like Jason like this. And he says this, I'll give you a quote of his. He says this, and I believe this too. He says, "We need to inch our way out to the margins, to stand with the poor, the powerless, and the voiceless, that we can stand with those whose dignity has been denied, with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Occasionally, you'll be very fortunate and very blessed, and you'll be able to stand with those who are easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing can stop, and with the disposable so that one day there will come a day when we stop throwing people away." When I hear these words, I want to ask that Chicago leader and that charter school guy and all of you, who's your Jason? And if you don't have one, you should. It's when we get to know kids like Jason that we stop making false assumptions about children and their worth. And we need to lose those assumptions in order to create disruption. I learned this firsthand from my time at Finger. My team and I weren't able to affect real change until we first pried loose a lot of our assumptions and our bias. For example, and I'm not proud of this, but I share this with you because I don't just want to point the finger. My mom used to always say, when you point the finger at somebody else, you got three pointing right back at you. So I'm just going to keep this real. So I'm not proud of this, but when I first arrived at Finger, I drew from my mom's example. The school's in a lot of chaos, and that's a whole other story. There were over 1,200 kids. We had a lot of problems. And I assumed because of how I was raised, what our kids really needed was some structure and some consequences. So immediately when I got to the school, I came in and I implemented this really strict policy of suspensions and expulsions. I was sending kids out the door, left and right. I even got this giant whiteboard on wheels, the kind you kind of wheel around into your classrooms and stuff like that. I got this big whiteboard. I had these white cards that I printed out, and they had the kid's picture on it. And the kids were the top, I called them my hot 75. And they were the 75 kids in my school who were causing the most issues. And I don't mean little issues. These were real serious issues. I won't get into all of them, but real serious issues. And I had these dots where I color-coded them. So I had the top 75 who were causing the issues that were causing all these arrests in my school. And I essentially put their names up on the board on these placards with their pictures. And then every kid had a red dot, a yellow dot, and a green dot. And basically, if you had the red dot, you were tried and convicted in my eyes. You were getting up out of my school. Now, looking back, if I'm honest with myself and I'm honest with you, and I feel embarrassed to say it, but it's true, I was really branding some of the most vulnerable kids as not even worth the trouble. I was otherizing my own students. I soon learned that my bias for rules and regimen, which came from my mom, you can blame your mom for everything. We're going to blame my mom for that, was the wrong approach. Day after day, night after night, our students' ecosystem was subjecting them to regular and repeated trauma. Throwing them back into that environment was no solution. So we went back to the drawing board and we began devising this set of new approaches to address the needs of our student. Now, this required a good deal of trial and error. Here, too, I'm reminded of disruptors like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon. I want to just underscore this. none of those were born fully realized. None of them were born fully realized. Uber began as this traditional black limousine service, which, by the way, I didn't even know that until I started writing this speech, and I'm like, okay, oh my God, I didn't even know that. But anyway, they began as a traditional black car limousine service that was actually more expensive than hiring a taxi. Airbnb started, you guys probably know this, I knew it, it began because a couple of roommates couldn't afford their rent, and so they put an air mattress in the living room and rented out that space. And Amazon was launched right here, out of this small garage where they only sold books. It took a great deal of experimentation, call it trial and error, to become what these three businesses are today. And get this, the experimentation is ongoing. You may not know this, but Amazon and Airbnb are barely profitable, while last year Uber lost over $3 billion. Yet, they are all viewed as huge successes because they aren't being judged by their short-term returns, but they're being judged by their long-term potential. So I want to ask you, if Wall Street is willing to invest in the long-term potential of businesses, shouldn't we be willing to invest in the long-term potential of our kids? You see, we can clap on that. You see, this is what I truly believe. Disruption is not, it's a process. It's not a moment. Disruption is a process. It is not a moment. But it's always guided by the determined pursuit of a really big idea. And our big idea at our school can be summed up in 2 words, and it had to do about getting proximate. So a good number of the students at the school really struggled in terms of adult role models. So we were determined to bring adults into their lives who were available, who cared, and were ready to help. And in this way, we were going to remake the school into a stabilizing environment inside the school, because our kids live in such a chaotic environment outside the school. So we did things large and small. We experimented, we took risks. Let me tell you something, we had plenty of trials and plenty of errors. We did everything from bringing in more counselors, to implementing restorative justice practices. We had a big push on social emotional learning before social emotional learning became what's in vogue. We hired as many adult male teachers as possible. We brought in things like anger management and grief counseling. Teachers and my teams went out into the community. Oftentimes it was hard to get parents to come into the school, who would go out to the community and have home visits. But most critically, and I could go on with a laundry list of things that we tried, but most critically, we never stopped challenging our assumptions. For example, and you guys will probably get this, I didn't get it, I was a new principal, I didn't get this at first, now I do. But before every holiday, the number of disruptions just increased on campus, so especially involving those kids who were on my Hot 75 list. And this at first was really puzzling until it dawned on us that for the students, for all the students, but particularly for those who were on the Hot 75 list, vacation meant this increased stress because they would have to go for days without the kind of rhythm and sanctuary of the school. So to address this, again, trial and error, we decided, okay, we're going to make this an even more kind of welcoming womb, if you will. So we increased the air of festivity as vacations approached by bringing in this huge Christmas tree, and we gave out these small gifts, and we did things to make the school feel like a home. And we even had one of our security guards dress up as Santa Claus, which the kids thought was hilarious. And those measures might sound small, and they might even sound trite to those who are in this room, but trust me when I tell you that they weren't. Yet again, I think there are these parallels to the work of disruptors in the business world. Companies like Amazon are in a continuous feedback loop with their customers. They know that the people in this room and beyond this room want nearly instant gratification, so they keep coming up with these faster and faster delivery methods until it almost gets scary, how fast things show up at your doorstep. For people who work in education like us, the feedback loop is built in. Every day our customers are right in front of us. There's no need for surveys or focus groups. We just need to listen and to act. At Finger, our actions added up to some real results. During our team's 6 years at the school, you can see our state graduation rate went from 47% to over 80%. Our dropout rate went from over 20% to less than 2%. And the arrests that were once over 300 a year dropped down to less than 10. On the surface, oh, thanks guys. Thanks. I had a great team. I had an amazing team. On the surface, those numbers tell a story of improved performance, but dig deeper, I believe they tell an even more important story than that. And it was about getting greater justice for kids who had experienced really a fraction of what I would argue they deserved. And that's how we disrupted things at one high school in one neighborhood in one city. So I left Finger about 2 years ago, and I started an organization called Chicago Beyond. And this same disruptive work continues there, just in a different form. We aim to disrupt the status quo, to draw a spotlight and provide support to the work of those who are serving young people who often go, again, unseen, unheard, and ununderstood. So what happens next? I think you guys happen next. You do. You see, and we've all been here, I know we've all been in our conferences and our professional developments, and all too often you hear a speaker lay out a problem and they propose a solution, and then we nod our heads, and if we're really good students, we take some notes, and we move on to the next presentation. And then we take an Uber back to our Airbnb, and again our plane, and we fly home, and basically return to business as usual. And during this process, I would argue we physically move around, but truly we're just staying in our bubbles if we're being really honest. Well, if we want to achieve greater justice for all kids, this really isn't good enough. We've got to do a different kind of disruption, and it's the kind that's really, really difficult, y'all. It's really difficult. We've got to disrupt ourselves. And this is how real change always happens. It starts with the individual, and it rises up from the bottom. This is what happened when Rosa Parks was on that bus. It's what happened in that Amazon garage, and it's what's happening right now with those kids down at Parkland as they're turning their grief into action. As that Parkland High student, Emma Gonzalez, bravely said, "It is time to call BS." It is time to call BS on those who think they can toss out 25% of our kids. It is time to call BS on a system that gives the kids that have the least and who need the most, they give them the least. It's time to call BS on those who are not funding education, and it's time to call BS on the ecosystems that are literally starving and killing those who are most vulnerable, the weakest. And most of all, it's time to call BS on ourselves. Because we're all guilty of making false assumptions, of otherizing our fellow citizens, and of looking the other way. And I'm gonna tell you all, that's the real bullshit. It's not out there. I would argue the real bullshit is in here. And we all have the power to call it out and to stop it today. If we do this, I truly believe that everything changes. Once we shift, I believe policy shifts. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't expect you to leave this room. I don't expect everyone in here to be like these bias-free change agents for justice. Disruption doesn't work that way. It takes trial, and it takes error, and it starts slowly, but it has to start. And it has to start right now. And it starts with you, and it starts with me. Thank you. Hey. All righty. Well, guys, I think we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So we will kick it. And I haven't used this before, so y'all gonna have to work with me on this. So we'll start out, if you go onto your phones, you can type in questions, and we can do a little Q&A. So the first one that popped up is, how can schools issue serious consequences to students without involving in or out of school suspensions? Okay, let me actually pause. I forgot something I wanted to have you guys do. So I'm gonna answer that question, I promise. What I want you to do, and this is really important, is we're gonna flip the Q&A. And I want to flip it to ask you guys a question first. So I want you to just think for a second, and I want you to think of someone or maybe a group, perhaps someone in the margins who you may have otherized. So just like, we're gonna flip the script, you're gonna think about this question. Someone, or maybe a group, perhaps someone on the margins who you might have otherized. So in other words, like, who's your Jason? I'm gonna give you about 60 seconds. Okay, now, underneath your chairs, you're gonna find some Post-it notes. Yay, Post-it notes. Grab your Post-it notes. Hope they didn't put them too far underneath there. So grab your Post-it notes. If you can't reach that far, don't worry about it. Just give some of your neighbors Post-it notes. Everybody got Post-it notes? If you got Post-it notes, say yes. Yes. All right. All right. So grab your Post-it notes. Now, listen to I'm in teacher mode now. Listen to the full directions before you start writing. Okay. So I want you to use this Post-it note, listening to all the directions, to write down whoever or whatever that group is. Now, I want to be really clear. Do not write, it was Sally Sue at 1222 West 64th Street on October the 7th who has blood type A and I otherized her. No. But I want, keep it general. I just want you to like write that down. So I'm going to give you, don't overthink it. Write that person down or that group down. Remember, keep it general. Everybody got a Post-it note? Hold it up in the air. Everybody got it? Okay. Awesome, 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 awesome. Okay. So what you're going to do is take your Post-it note, which you have not written Sally Sue at 1227, West 76th Street, and pass your Post-it note to the left, but they all go down the rows. So pass them down. Don't be scared. They all go down. Pass them down. Pass them down. Yep, you can just pass them right on down. Meet your neighbor, say, hey, neighbor. There you go, hey, neighbor. Talk to your neighbors. Cool. So we're gonna finish passing those Post-it notes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, they should be all the Post-it notes should have made their way towards the end of this row, of the rows along here. Someone's gonna come around and collect them. And if you look to the back over there, there's some white paper, and we're just gonna kind of creatively just post those up. And the goal really is symbolically that we leave that otherizing behind, that once we walk through those doors today, that whoever that was or whatever that group was, that we become more conscious in our actions as we begin to interact with that group or that person or whatever that is for you. And the idea truly is what I talked about, is that disruption is not this moment, it's a process. And so hopefully that'll be like a physical reminder as we walk out the door with all those really colorful Post-it notes. So. Yay, okay. So with that said, we're gonna get to some questions. The first one I had was, how can schools issue serious consequences to students without involving in or out of school suspension? So I could just tell you what I did, and I don't claim to know, or my team, and what we decided to do. And again, I don't claim this is like the panacea for all schools, what every school should be doing. But for us, a really big part of when serious infractions would occur, and I mean very serious infractions, there was some type of restorative justice involved. So it was important for our kids to understand why what they had done was causing harm to the community. So for us, I thought it would, because I shared with you who my mom was, so you already know she was strict. It wasn't so much about like putting kids out the door and they somehow came back magically different from a 10-day suspension, although from how I was raised, I really thought one would come back magically changed after having come back from a 10-day suspension, but it didn't really work. So a big piece for us was around restorative justice. So it was really having the young person sit down with whoever that person who they potentially had victimized was, right? So it was everything from like really serious fights. I don't mean just fights like, oh, you're so Sally Sue stole my pencil, and we got into a little dust up. And I'm talking about fights where folks got arrested, like real serious things where there were injuries. We still would have these like points where we would come back together, and the student would have to, the victim had a chance to talk about how that made them feel, and there was a chance for repairing of harm, and I can't underestimate how important that was. So that was really big for us. I think that, oh, they just moved the question, but that was a huge piece for us. And I think we have to begin to look at other ways other than suspension and expulsion, because ultimately you can put somebody out of a school. You can throw them out and do whatever, but really what then happens to them, I think about, I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, but like, that young man in Parkland, right? He was out of the school, but ultimately we see what happened there. Next one, what are you doing at Chicago Beyond? So Chicago Beyond is a youth equity platform. So essentially, like I talked, we're focused on those kids who are most vulnerable on the south and west sides of Chicago. And ultimately, we desire to really spur change and to invest in those young people's lives. And so we do it in a variety of ways. The first is getting resources out to those communities and to those kids. Stay tuned, follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. We're getting ready to announce some other really cool things that we're up to. Next up, what are your most practical suggestions for making change in schools like the one you and your team influenced? I think one, it's really about the idea of a team. Like, I think too oftentimes there's this notion of like the Joe Clark principle, or there's this notion of like, one person or one entity comes in and somehow saves the whole world. I just don't believe that. I've always believed in teams, and I think everything from like teacher leadership is critical in schools, and making sure like everyone's got a voice and we're all leading in unison. I think that's huge. For us and for schools like us, it was a big deal to have everything from restorative justice to social emotional learning to things like care team. And care team is ultimately, when I talk about that Hot 75, ultimately the Hot 75 list, once I like woke up and realized I was like otherizing my kids and just kicking kids out and not doing anything by them, we switched that Hot 75 list to what we then called care team. And care team was a group of counselors. It was myself, my assistant principal, there was some basketball and football coaches, and social workers, all different types of people, teachers, there was a security guard on care team. And we basically would look at what was going on with those kids and figure out like plans, like what are we gonna do to help reach that particular child? It was kind of all minds working together on those young people. So I think it varies. Let's see. How can you encourage conversations about our practices in restorative justice in schools or systems that refuse to address or acknowledge what's broken? That's a really good question. Miss Peoples, whoever answered that. Okay, Miss Peoples, I see you. Okay, that's really good. Okay, so again, just being totally honest, for me, restorative justice was really hard. I came in, like I told you, just like suspending kids. And I remember when someone first brought the idea of restorative justice and peace circles to me, I was like, I won't give you the full text of what I said because it's inappropriate to say at a conference. But I was not going for that because I thought it could never work. Finger was the real deal. It wasn't like we weren't in Mayberry. We didn't have a little few dust-ups. There was real things that were happening. And I truly believe that couldn't work there. And it wasn't until I felt like I had thrown everything at our children and things weren't working that I realized, oh, this actually, and we tried some stuff with restorative justice, I realized, oh, it actually does work. Get your phone. Just kidding. So I think the biggest thing is around like having people actually see it. For me, it was important to see it, feel it, go out and experience it, go to other schools where I had worked that mirrored my school. And I think for some people, it's just that tangibleness of being able to connect so they can see that it actually does work. There's some amazing, I've seen sessions and stuff here talking about it. I'm sure they have great resources and ways in which to talk about that. We got a couple of minutes left. Let's see. How did you help staff to question their assumptions while also retraining retaining great staff and help them deal with secondary trauma. Okay, can you go to that slide, Eva, with the home visits? Okay, so for us, like some of my teachers had never experienced anything like the community in which we resided. And so, you know, a child comes into a classroom and the child's not prepared for class, or they come in and they're disheveled, or they come in, I mean, fill in the blank, right? Sometimes teachers get pissed off, like, you know, like I've given you this chance, I've tried to work with you, and you haven't done this. And they begin to build on these assumptions about what Johnny has or hasn't done, or what his capacity is to learn, or if he even wants to learn. And so for me, I didn't realize this until probably about year 2, maybe halfway through year 2, maybe into year 3, it was really important that my teachers get out into the community. I'm just a very community-oriented person, so from day one, I was out in the community with other members of my team, but my teachers actually weren't. So for us, it was a big deal to get them really out into the community and visiting homes. And it's amazing what a simple act of like taking some professional development time and like taking like 60 minutes and kind of all dividing up into clusters and kind of going out together and visiting students' home. Again, those kids who are most challenged are the ones who keep popping up on your radar screen, going out to their homes and actually visiting with parents and seeing how some of our kids were living. And that, for my teachers, was huge. We also did a bunch of stuff in terms of like just like professional readings, and like it was a constant conversation. It wasn't like, you know, we did this one professional development, you know, we had this one speaker come in, or we watched this one documentary, and like everything changed. It was this ongoing process. I mean, we still, don't get me wrong, we still battle with it, but that proximity, that getting proximate is something. I think it's the reason why a lot of the conversation exists today in our country around us and them. And I think the reason why it exists is because a lot of people haven't had any type of contact with people who they consider like the other. It becomes harder to otherize someone when you're getting proximate and you understand, you've seen their experience, and you get to see how much alike they are to you. And that was really big for us as a staff. In terms of retaining great staff, the other part of that question, it really had to do with teacher leadership. So I had a bunch of, you know, I feel like young teachers want to come in and they want to come into like a really challenging situation. They want to like, you know, they want to dig in. And so for me, in order to retain them, it was like, okay, you're going to get more and more opportunities for leadership. So, I mean, my teachers basically led my school. I do not claim to have done anything with Finger High School without my teachers and my entire staff. And they were essentially leading like almost all of the efforts that were at our school. And the last part was, how do we help them deal with secondary trauma? You know, this is something that we never quite figured out. It's actually one of the reasons why I wound up leaving Fenger. I was really, really emotionally tired from having seen too many kids die. And I think that really affected a lot of my kids, or a lot of my teachers too, in that, you know, it wasn't just like a student would pass away, or, you know, students have hard situations and you're helping them navigate that, and you don't somehow experience that trauma yourself. And so we had like counseling services, obviously, that were available, but I never quite figured that out. And I think that's something as educators, when we think about some of the most marginalized communities that are living in the kind of most economically fragile areas that deal with a lot of violence, as educators, we really have to talk about that, and we have to figure out solutions behind that. And I don't think that comes from on top and goes down. I think we build some of those solutions really bottom up, and I just believe that's the way you get the best solutions is bottom up. So we never quite figured that one out. So I'm going to end on that. Thank you so much for being here, and please follow us and check us out, the work that we're doing at Chicago Beyond, and Wakanda Forever. See you all later.